to the BankTalk podcast, the show where we talk to leaders and experts from the community banking sector. Whether you are a current CEO or aspire to be one, this podcast will give you valuable insights and advice on how to run your financial institution better. Each episode features a different topic and a guest who shares their experience and knowledge with us. Tune in and learn something new with BankTalk podcast.
Hi, and welcome to BankTalk. I'm Charlie Kelly, your host and partner at Remedy Consulting. Today, we're going to talk first of two in a series of succession planning. I ran into Phil Buffington of Balch and Bingham at the ICBA event a few weeks ago, and Phil was doing a session on succession planning, and I just happened to get him beforehand, and we started talking about the fact that we hadn't done a session on the BankTalk podcast in some time on succession planning. So I thought I would get in touch with him. You know, he had kind of asked me, what part are you interested in? And I always thought there was only one part of succession planning. I thought it was all the same thing. And we got to talking about succession planning for not necessarily your employees, but for your shareholders. And I thought it was a good segue from our previous podcast that we had just done on family planning around shareholders. So I thought this tied in pretty well, and I think it makes for an interesting topic, one that I hadn't really considered before. Hopefully you'll find it as interesting. Without further ado, we'll get to Phil. Okay, welcome back to BankTalk. I'd like to introduce Phil Buffington. Phil, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Charlie. Glad to be here.
So, Phil, you and I met. We met at an ICBA event. And one thing I forgot to ask you, you were doing a succession planning session. We happened to get in touch with each other about that time. And I don't think I ever asked you, what interest level does an attorney have in succession planning? So if you wouldn't mind, give us a short background and how do those two tie together? I just never understood that.
Absolutely. And that's a great question. And I don't think a lot of people stop and think about that. So I appreciate it. And again, I'm with Balch and Bingham. We're primarily out of Birmingham, but we've got a 6-state footprint that we operate in, but we have a practice throughout the country. And a lot of you may know us if you're in the southeastern United States. You may know us elsewhere too, because like I said, I've got clients all over the country. But if you don't know us, I would welcome the opportunity for y'all to get to know us and look at that, because we're good at what we do. We're passionate about what we do, and we enjoy what we do and try to bring value to our clients. But back to your question, because enough about me. Why do we get into succession planning? And I tell people all the time, you can break topics apart and look at them separately and talk on them. And in this instance, that's what I was doing. I had broken succession planning out to give a presentation on succession planning, but it's really kind of a subpart of strategic planning for the institution. If you're looking at what the strategy of the institution is on where it is now, where it wants to be short term and where it wants to be long term, part of that process has to involve succession planning and being prepared to make sure that you're looking at an orderly process to move the institution from one stage to the next. And that could just be time frame, but it also could be one stage to the next as to how big the institution is. Are you going from a $500 million institution to a $1 billion institution, or a $2 billion institution to trying to get up to 10 billion or above? All of that has to play into the plan. And what's vital with all of that is, where are you with succession planning, not only from a management standpoint, your executive officers and other levels of management, but your board standpoint, and also from your shareholder base. How are we going to accomplish where we're trying to go?
Okay, so Phil, we had this long conversation around succession planning, and part of the part that interested me the most was shareholder succession planning, because I hadn't really heard that term before. When I think of succession planning, I think of, keeping your folks around and making sure that you have a plan to, if one leaves or one's going to retire, you got somebody that fills in the gap, compensation, all that thing, but this concept of shareholder succession planning, how would you define that? What does that mean to you?
That's a great question. And really, when you stop and think about it, shareholder succession planning is not much different than management or board succession planning. It's generally just an orderly process by which you transition the ownership of the bank from one generation to a next in an effective manner. And again, that's what you're trying to do with senior management, CEOs, and other senior level positions. That's what you're trying to do with the board. Well, that same aspect holds true with shareholder bases, in particular when you've got some larger shareholders there that really can affect the direction of the bank and the overall vision. But, some of the similarities between executive succession and shareholder succession would be you want your shareholder group to be present. You want them to be part of what the institution is doing. You want them to be engaged in making the institution better. This is all true of management. The other thing is you want them to be happy. That keeps them there. That keeps them going. And then the last two would be is, just like in compensation with executives, you want to make sure your shareholders are getting a return on their investment, that they're happy with that return. And along those lines, as a CEO moves forward and gets older and they're ready to retire, you may have shareholders that are getting older that are ready to move on. And how are they going to transition that ownership? So if you're not thinking about those issues, what I find is that you end up having to deal with things in an emergency basis that you didn't otherwise expect to have to deal with because certain events happen. So I just think when you're talking about succession planning, the natural tendency for me is to start in the most applicable, and that's in management because it's day to day. Then the board, because you need to have that plan for multiple reasons, regulators being one of them. But the last one being the shareholder group. And I think it's equally as important to be included in that topic because of the impact it can have on the overall vision and success of the institute.
After, sitting in quite a few board meetings, to me, I think why this was so interesting to me was that the first two seem like they're, I don't want to say easy, but certainly natural part of a board meeting. But succession planning for the shareholders might be a little stickier, right? And I don't know if that's what you've experienced or not, but, and by stickier, I mean, ownership is a little different than management from the perspective of, you as a board aren't going to tell me what I'm going to do with my shares. But I don't think that's what you're saying. I think what you're saying is, no, we just need to know if we're still going to be in control of this thing when it's all said and done. Is it a natural, I mean, there's no committee around shareholder succession planning on the board that I've ever heard of, right?
No.
Give me your thoughts on that. What do you think there?
Well, and I really think it's just part of the overall general succession planning part, the corporate governance part. And it falls into both categories. I really call succession planning corporate governance because that's you deciding how you're going to transition your institution. And so shareholder would go in that. You're right. It's easier to talk about senior management succession planning with a board than it is to talk about board succession planning because at that point you start talking to people about, well, when are you going to age out? Are we going to have age restrictions? When are we going to transition you off the board and get new people on? And that's always a touchy issue because it's got a personal aspect to it. The same thing is true with shareholder succession planning. And in a lot of instances, what I tell people is that's not a topic that you can just bring up in the board meeting without some initial prep work. Management or your chair of the board probably need to engage with the shareholder groups that you've got the most concern with, and that would be the larger groups or the family groups and what they're planning. And in most instances, that's what I do with my CEO. We sit down and we work on a plan on how to address those issues with the individual director before we have that collective conversation. Because again, I think transparency is important, but I also think not surprising people in issues that are real personal to them is equally important to make sure that you've got a common bond on that board that you don't break, and that everybody feels like they can trust each other in moving forward, looking at what's in the best interest of the institution. And I would say this. I mean, and this ranges. I've got several smaller community banks and some larger community banks that have large groups of shareholders, and everybody is different. And you've got to treat every situation different. That's why when I tell people, I can give you a plan to go by, but if all you're going to do is take that plan and change the names and tweak a few things, it's really not your plan, because you have to work through it and really decide what the issues are and where you want to go. Because, Charlie, if you own 25% of a bank and I'm your CEO, what I want to know is, as you move forward in life, what are your thoughts on how you're going to transition that ownership? Generally
Right, because if you, as an example, if I split it up 10 different people, that looks a little different for the CEO, wouldn't it?
Well, it does.
Or if you sell it, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I would think those would be a couple of scenarios.
Absolutely. My biggest concern is going to be if you want to sell 25% of the bank. Now I've got somebody brand new that I really hadn't gotten used to, and I may not know, and all you did was go out and sell it, maximize value. But at least if you know you're going to do that, how I come back to you is, Charlie, what we want to do is work out a plan where we can buy that stock from you and be prepared to do it. And we're not asking you to give us a hometown discount. If you want to, that's great, but we're not asking for that. But at least give us an opportunity to purchase that stock back in, either with other shareholders that are already here, with the board, with management, by possibly giving some options there, or just through the bank itself on redeeming the stock and taking it out of the market. So we've got it. But the other thing is, if you've got 5 children, then I'm going from 1 shareholder to 5 shareholders. And this is where it gets a little bit difficult, because if each one of your children has 3 children and then something happens to 1 or 2 of your children, now what I've done is I've gone from 5 to 13 or whatever number that we come up with. And so my shareholder base is growing all of a sudden. If you've got 2 or 3 groups, or let's just say you've got several groups that own 10 or 15% of the stock, and all of a sudden it starts getting split out like that, you end up with a wide range of shareholders in a large area, some of which would be in your community, some probably would have no connection. And where do you really want to go with that shareholder base? And again, it's not you trying to tell a shareholder what to do. It's really exploring what that shareholder is thinking about, what they want to do with their stock, and making sure that they've thought about how that impacts the institution. And if they really just want a liquidity event, then working towards a goal to create that liquidity event for them. And there's always there's always a way to do that. You just need to be able to plan, and you don't need to be planning in 30 days. You really need to be looking at that over a period of time where it can be strategic and you can be prepared, where it doesn't have an impact on other shareholders, and it is maximizing the value for the person that wants the liquidity event.
Oh, that's great. And my next question, which I think you might have answered partially, was I could foresee if now generally I imagine that most of these have some type of a stock buyback provision to them, but if all of a sudden that 25% shareholder comes up and says, "Hey, I've got a buyer. I want out. Can you buy me out tomorrow?" That's a really, right? I mean, that could force, depending on how many shareholders are getting out, I could imagine that could force a sale of the bank. That could force hey, we got to do a fundraising, and it's not going to be a short one. I mean, we got only so many days, or he's going to pass it on, right? So you don't want to be reactive, I guess, is my point, right? You want to be as proactive as possible.
I would agree. And if they're at a level that they're the largest shareholder in the institution, then there's obviously some regulatory hurdles they've got to clear to be able to do that. If you're the largest shareholder and you're over 10%, then chances are you're going to have to go through a change of control notice. If you're over 25%, that may trigger another type of filing that you'd have to go through on a regulatory standpoint. So even helping the shareholder plan for those events is helpful. But again, you mentioned it, stock buyback. could be an option. When you're looking at that shareholder base, I really think there's some key questions to look at. And one of those is analyzing the ownership as it exists today. Part of that is identifying how that ownership could look in the future if certain events happen. If I've got 10 children and I own 25% of the bank, all of a sudden, 10 people may own 2.5% of the bank.
Oh.
And is really what you want. And if they decide to give it to their children and they each have 3 children and they're living all over the country, the next thing you know, you're dealing with 30 new shareholders all over the country calling you saying, Charlie, what are you doing to make the bank more profitable? and what are you doing to strengthen the stock value? What are we doing from the market standpoint to improve our brand in the market? What are we looking at on growth? You're getting inundated by a bunch of shareholders that really aren't connected to the bank or the communities in some instances. So one of the things that I tell people to look at is if you've got a lot of small shareholders outside of the market, look at things like a reverse stock split. And that's the bank buying back some of its stock. And it's for the smaller shareholders because the communications with smaller shareholders is usually more time consuming and less efficient from a cost standpoint. So that's a viable option, but the buyback would still be there. If you had larger shareholder groups, even looking at a shareholders agreement where you can look at getting with the bigger groups, figuring out how you're going to transition their ownership to provide the liquidity event. So you'll be able to fund that when the need arises. Part of that whole issue too is that if you're looking at some stock awards or some stock options for directors and officers, that may be an easy way to raise some capital short term to be able to put some more money back in from the sale of stock other than a stock offering that would take a little bit longer. And again, you don't see ESOPs used a lot, but an ESOP would be an alternative that you could look at to determine what you're going to do. But all of that requires the board to stop and spend time on planning for future events. And that planning would entail, in my opinion, defining what the bank's market is and making sure that your shareholder base is really engaged in that market to help drive value for the institution and their shares in the institution.
We'll be right back.
If you're dealing with a technology vendor, consider giving Remedy Consulting a call. At Remedy, we're dedicated to helping our clients get the most out of their tech spend. If you're considering changing one of your major tech providers or are renewing a contract with a vendor, the Remedy team may be able to add some value. Our clients enjoy our deep experience working inside these major vendors, and that background helps us ask questions which eliminate headaches and expense for our clients. Sometimes that's immediate relief, in the way of your vendor invoices, and sometimes that comes in the form of contract language protection for a strategic move that you may want to make several years later. The group of experts at Remedy have years of experience in core systems, digital, mobile, payments, item capture, commercial banking, pretty much the whole gamut of technology for financial institutions. Remedy approaches the BankTalk podcast the same way we approach our client engagements. We always try to fill some knowledge gaps, but also just have enough life experience stories to remain entertaining. So if you're renewing a technology contract or you have projects going on, just need another opinion or a project manager from outside your organization, reach out to us at remedyconsult.net. Thank you, and we appreciate you downloading the BankTalk podcast. Now let's get back to our episode. Yeah, I think of it, based on what you said, as almost like your lending stress test. You run a couple scenarios of what this thing looks like if XYZ were to happen in the, outside of our environment. If you would do that, you may not like what you see, if A, B, or C occurs. And, maybe A is Charlie, a large stockholder, retires. Charlie dies. Somebody else in the family buys his shares, whatever those scenarios are that would really shake up ownership. If they were to occur, what does that look like, and how do you like yourself now?
That's a great point. One of the program that I didn't mention, and people have to be really careful with this, but I'll call it a matching program. You've always got shareholders that want to buy, and you've always got shareholders that want to sell. What you don't want to do is let your institution get into the business of being a market maker. But what you can do is have a list of people that have an interest in buying and a list of people who have an interest in selling, and basically provide that list when somebody comes to you and says, I'm ready to sell stock, or I want to buy stock. You can give each one of them the list of people that you know are interested. Let them reach out to them individually and have private transactions among themselves that don't include the institution. But in essence, you are creating a matching program that allows you to, at least in some way, help control who your shareholder base is going to be, because you're providing the people who are interested in being the shareholders, and you're also providing the people who are interested in the liquidity event. And those are programs that you'll see. You've just got to be careful with it. You've got to be careful about the disclosures. You've got to be careful about insider trading, if it includes your directors, and making sure that there aren't strategic events like an M&A transaction that are going on, or a capital raise that's going on, that people aren't, that's not disclosed on the front end, where they come back and question why you allowed a stock transaction to occur when you knew there were things going on. So there's certain parts of that you need to work through, but that's a program that I've got banks that utilize that, and it works for them.
Maybe more to your point of how many shareholders do you want outside the community? If you could transition the outside the communities to somebody who wants to be a shareholder that's, in state and in the community, something like that is a vested interest, you might get a more engaged one and a more educated one too. If they want to own that stock, there's a reason for it.
Absolutely.
They think you're doing something right or whatever.
You're right. And I'll go back to the reverse stock split when I said smaller shares, because generally speaking, again, this is no knock on smaller shareholders, because they drive a lot of value to the bank, and a lot of times they're really interested in the bank. But if you're a bank in South Georgia, let's say Macon, and you've got 10 or 15 shareholders in California that don't really have any connection back with Georgia anymore, they just inherited it, and you're paying good dividends, and they only own, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 shares, and it's a very small percentage. Quite frankly, in some instances, it may drive overall shareholder value to pay a premium to those shareholders to repurchase their shares, just because the return you can give back to the remaining shareholders on really having a smaller shareholder base, and can really focus and not utilize resources on people that aren't really providing a lot of value to the organization and the overall value to the stock. Those are programs that are worth looking for. But if that shareholder owns 10 or 15% of the stock in California, chances are they're going to be an active owner anyway. So that's really where you don't look at that unless they're just trying to accomplish a liquidity event. It's really the smaller shareholders that you try to either buy up in a tender offer or a buyback, or reverse out just from a corporate transaction.
Yeah, that's a great perspective. Well, Phil, this has been great. I have one other question I wanted to just cover before we finish. In our pre-session, we were having this conversation around, is a small set of shareholders good for the institution? And, more specifically, if your CEO is a shareholder or a family member or something along those lines, right? I think you had mentioned something like, you don't always find that the person that's running the operation, or the family that controls a portion of the stock, they may be powerful, but they may not be working in the best interests of the overall. Can you speak to that a little bit?
I can.
What are your thoughts there?
Let me start off describing basically what those responsibilities are, and then I can transition into more about that and give you some examples. But anybody serving on the board of directors has fiduciary duties to all shareholders of the institution. And I could go further and say they have duties to the depositors and the customers and the creditors of the bank, but let's don't even get into that. Let's just say all other shareholders. So in the example of you've got a president and CEO that's the major shareholder, he can't just be taking action that's solely for his best interest. He has to look at what else is going on in the institution and has to recognize that he's got those duties to all the other shareholders. And in part, it's a duty to comply with all federal and state laws and the rules and regulations of the regulators. But there's also what's called a duty of loyalty and a duty of care. And those duties create the fiduciary duties that they have to adhere to. And I can remember a few years back, I was sitting in a board meeting and we were talking about corporate governance issue. And this director kept saying, well, this isn't really what my family wants. This is really, we need to look at this a different way. And at one point, I had to remind all directors that you're not there to represent just yourself when you're a director. And you're not there just to represent your family. You're there to do what's in the best interest of all the shareholders as a collective group. And that's your fiduciary duty to do that. Now, when you start with that, it's got to shape your whole thought process. I've got another client that I do work for that years ago, and this was a family-owned bank, the regulators came in and basically they had some other shareholders, but it was basically a family-owned bank. I'd say they probably owned 70% of the bank. The regulators came in and they asked this chairman of the board, they said, look, I don't really see a lot of board minutes here, and y'all, I really need to know that y'all are having a board meeting. And the chairman looked at the regulator and said, well, son, this is what we do. Every morning when my wife and I have breakfast, we have a board meeting. Well, that's a wonderful story and a great tale, and I'm sure I've embellished it some, but it's a great point that may be happening, but they still have that fiduciary duty to all shareholders. And just because it's in a family doesn't mean that there aren't fiduciary duties, because I've got another bank recently that had some extenuating circumstances. The CEO had to exit. It was truly a family-owned bank, but it was probably 2 or 3 families back down. The grandfather may have owned it, or the grandfather and his brother may have owned it. And so you start looking at, now we've got really 3 family groups, and they really had not looked at the fact that a lot of their family wealth was tied up in this institution. And now we've got an emergency situation where the CEO is being removed, and now there's a little bit of infighting going on. But they've got to remember, at that point, you still can't start acting completely selfishly on your own part, because you've got those fiduciary duties. And that gets back to, if they had stopped and taken a little bit of time to deal with shareholder succession, because they dealt with management succession and board succession, but not shareholder succession, then some of those problems may have been resolved, where you created a liquidity event and got some of the dissenting groups out of the bank before it really got more complicated than it should have. But it's really important for all directors to remember that they've got those fiduciary duties to each and every shareholder, not just their family members.
Right. Yeah. And that's a great sort of segue into the separation of duties between when you're a board member, you have a certain set of governance you have to follow. And when you're a shareholder, you may have different interests, and you got to make sure you separate the two.
Absolutely.
Well, Phil, thank you for joining us today. This has been great. As we talked about, I think we probably have another one in the future we're going to do, which is, the succession planning at both the employee and the board level, and what all that means. But we'll do that down the road. Just wanted to thank you for joining us and sharing some of your wisdom.
Well, Charlie, I certainly enjoyed it. It's always great to visit with you, and I look forward to having more conversations with you in the future. And look, I think you're like me. We're both very passionate about the industry and want to provide value to it. And hopefully people who listen to this will be able to have some good takeaways that will help them with their institution.
I believe they will. Thank you very much. Okay, so that's it for Bank Talk. Thank you for listening today. Have a good day and keep on learning.
Thank you for listening to the Bank Talk podcast brought to you by Remedy Consulting. To reach out to Phil, you can reach him at balch, BALCH.com, or his email is pbuffington, BUFFINGTON @BALCH.com. And check out his professional profile on the website. Thanks again, and we will see you in the next episode.